Addiction. It rules all of our lives in one form or another. Some are legal, some are not. But one thing's for sure. We're all hooked on something.
Drugs are a fact. They exist. People use them. Nothing's going to change that. But now that drugs overdose has become the number one cause of injury-related death in the United States, something needs to be done.
What can change, what should change, is how we treat the victims of drugs, the addicts. For most of modern history, that's meant prison, plain and simple. But people can recover, and our country is wasting over $200 billion every year ignoring that.
In fact, for every dollar spent on rehab, $3 is saved in criminal justice and healthcare costs.
Why do we ignore that? And how did it get to be like this?
Addiction, along with other mental health issues, wasn't always considered a treatable medical condition. Instead, patients were subject to imprisonment and borderline torture. Lunatic asylums were the standard until Benjamin Rush joined the field. Rush discovered that if you limited addicts' drug consumption to smaller and smaller doses, you could slowly wean them off the drug. Prohibition was supposed to get rid of alcohol by making it illegal in the United States.
Before Prohibition, the average drinking American spent $17 a year on alcohol.
That's $252 nowadays.
But during Prohibition, the average drinking American spent $34 a year.
That's $500 nowadays. Prohibition put alcohol on the same level as other drugs, meaning the locations who sold alcohol were just as well off, if not more, by selling other illegal drugs.
This was also in part due to the fact that gangsters mostly owned and operated the underground locations where speakeasies were held. The first anti-drug law was passed in San Francisco 1875, enacting the first legislation against smoking opium. This law was rooted in an anti-immigrant belief that linked the war to racial discrimination. The war on drugs began in the 1970s. Nixon's chief domestic advisor said this about the war on drugs. You want to know what this was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. With Nixon as president, the government wanted to target leaders of specific communities to break them apart, raid their homes, and arrest them. Schedule I drugs allowed them to do so. But in 1972, other government officials recommended decriminalizing possession and distribution of marijuana for personal use. Nixon ignored and rejected those recommendations.
The big push, when the war on drugs happened was just, lock these people up, get them off the street. And we, our thinking at the time, as kind of during the Reagan administration, I think, the thinking at the time was, if we crack down on this thing, if the public sees as an example that we are demonizing these drug users and we are, rounding them up and we're locking them away, then people are going to stop doing drugs because they're too scared. It never, ever works that way. So what we ended up with is a lot of overcrowded prisons, which, I could talk for a whole nother hour on just the prison system. My job, I manage a small team of people who, when a client calls in for the first time, they get one of us. And what we try to do is kind of what we call a concierge model. So, we become whoever we connect with. Let's say they connect with me. I'm their point person through the rest of their treatment. So they call in, so many people call in. It's their first time ever calling in, asking for help, maybe for them, maybe for a loved one. They don't know anything. They're like, I know I got insurance. Does this cover insurance? What do I do? How do I get my person from here to there? How do I get myself from here to there? And so my job is to make all of that happen. I applied for the Santa Rosa Police Department kind of as a joke. because there was no way they were going to hire somebody like me to be a cop. But I was a police officer in the sense that if you put a cow in a tree, it's a bird. For me, going out there on the street as a cop and seeing, the drug addict in the gutter and seeing, the guy who, was threatening himself with a knife or had a gun to his head, my reaction wasn't to go, take my gun out and go, put it down, put it down, put it down. My reaction was to be like, hey man, come here, let's talk. Tell me what's going on. You seem like you're in a bad space, And that didn't really super duper fly well with the brass. It got to a point where I felt more connected with the people that I was going out in the street and contacting, the homeless people and the mentally insane people and all these things. I felt more connected with them than I did with a lot of my fellow officers. And so I made the decision to move away. The other piece of it too, kind of unique to drugs, was that, I'd pick up somebody for a drug charge, I'd take them to the jail, I'd book them into the jail, and by the time I'm done filling out the 2 hours of paperwork that it takes to book somebody into jail, the jail has already cut the guy loose with a citation, a ticket that he's never going to pay, for a court date that he's never going to show up to, and they cut him loose, and he's standing over at the bus stop waiting to go back to the place I pulled him out of. So I was like, and I would arrest the same people multiple times per week. I was like, this isn't doing anything.